In episode 37 of Bullet Heaven, we took a look at Jaleco's parody shooter Game Tengoku, the Game Paradise. Game Tengoku featured a decent selection of characters related to a bunch of really old, quite obscure games, only one of which made it to North American arcades, and none of which officially made it to home consoles in the West at all. So just what did we miss out on? Jaleco's first video games were produced for arcades as early as 1984. Their first Famicom title, Exerion, was launched in 1985 as a port of the 1984 original. In Exerion, you take on the role of a fighter pilot that's repelling an alien invasion through a series of infinitely repeating stages.
Exerion introduced some neat mechanics for its time. Unlike a lot of its contemporaries such as Space Invaders, Galaxian, and Galaga, your ship is not fixed to the bottom of the screen. Players are able to maneuver around their opposition, which will often not only be pretty aggressive, but also give chase.
Another neat thing about the controls in Exerion are the physics at play. Movement isn't as sharp as you might expect, but this is purely intentional. Just like in a real aircraft, you have to take into consideration the inertia of your ship while moving about. It takes a bit of time to get used to, but it still works fairly well.
Another interesting twist on the classic shooting formula are the two different shot types. Players have access to an unlimited double shot and a rapid-fire single shot, which is limited to a counter at the bottom of the screen. You can charge up the rapid shot by defeating your opposition with the double shots and by completing bonus rapid stages when the game loops.
The rapid shot is the easiest way to boost up your score. If you can take out a large chain of enemies, a bonus score that grows according to how many in a row are defeated will appear. Shooting the three-headed bird that appears shortly before the stage changes over will also grant a smooth 1,000 points. Given its alternating two-player mode and that this game can go on forever, Exerion makes for a pretty good competition piece.
The visuals are also pretty impressive for their early age. They beat the heck out of the static starfields that many early shooting games had. The sound, on the other hand, is nothing to write home about. The title jingle is a bit on the lame side, and while the enemy waves have different sounds, it can really grate on your nerves.
On the whole, though, Exerion isn't a terribly bad game at all, so long as you can get it for cheap. Formation Z was Jaleco's second Famicom game and was also released in 1985. In Formation Z, you take control of a robot that has the ability to transform into a space fighter on a mission to destroy enemy alien weaponry. Once again, there is a two-player alternating gameplay that's pretty good for competition.
There are two basic control schemes in Formation Z, one for when you're walking on the ground and another for when you are in flight. When you're on the ground, you can move forward and backward at a steady pace. Pressing up or down allows you to angle your shots, which are mapped to the B button. The A button allows you to jump, which can be handy in avoiding some shots, but movement while jumping requires you to be in motion before the jump.
Pressing and holding the A button will transform you into your space fighter form. In the air, the control scheme is 8-way with the same rate of movement as on the ground, but the stage will scroll at a much faster rate. The counter in the bottom corner will count down in fighter form, so care has to be used to make sure you don't end up as a burning patch in the ocean between land stages. Your fire will be angled in the direction that you fly, and pressing and holding A close to the ground will change you back into your robot form.
In order to recharge your fighter form, there are fuel pickups that can be obtained on the ground, which will increase the count by 10 each. In both forms, holding the fire button will allow you to fire a much more powerful shot than the standard gun. These shots are useful for taking out large, tougher enemies like bosses and tanks, which is handy.
The main thing about the control, though, is that it's slow. Very, very slow. To get further, a player really needs to understand how the enemy opposition works, which is also very difficult thanks to unpredictable enemy movement and attack patterns. While this certainly keeps you on your toes, this can be quite a bit of a bother.
In terms of scoring, there isn't a whole lot about Formation Z that lends itself to any sort of score boost, save for when the loop ends, which, in the grand scheme of things, is actually very short. Getting the highest score will more or less boil down for the most part to how much stuff you destroy, which again is harder than you may think, especially with how tiny your shots are, paired with unpredictable enemy movement.
Besides this, on the presentation front, the visuals here are pretty impressive, despite their relative simplicity. With multiple layers of parallax scrolling, there's a good sense of depth to the visuals that is actually quite rare on the Famicom.
Outside of a lonely-sounding title jingle and a sound effect for starting and gaining a life, all you'll hear is the sound of your weapons, the enemy's weapons, and explosions. That's it. This game needs a player that's quite a bit more forgiving of its flaws. If you have the right amount of nostalgia or patience and you can score it as cheaply as possible, it's still a game that might be fun once in a while.
Field Combat was Jaleco's fourth game on the Famicom and, once again, was released in 1985. In Field Combat, you take control of the Genesis 3 craft to overwhelm and capture enemy emplacements. The gameplay in Field Combat is vastly different from the other traditional shooting elements that are found in both Exerion and Formation Z.
For starters, the gameplay takes place in a closed-off arena battlefield. Various ground-based units make their advance, and it's up to you to take them out by either shooting or capturing them. At the end of the battlefield, there is an emplacement of 4 cannons that need to be destroyed in order to take the base.
Each stage has different obstacles to overcome while making your way to the base, and these stages also have various different types of ground units to take out as well. Capturing them will give you more points than simply destroying them. Whether you're capturing or destroying your opposition, everything needs to be aimed using the crosshair in front of the Genesis 3. Too close or too far and you get nothing.
Pressing the A button will fire a single shot downrange at the crosshair in front of the Genesis 3. Hitting your opponent can be tricky, but a little practice is all it takes to get decently good at hitting your opposition as you go.
The B button engages the capture beam. Once again, your crosshair is where the beam actually lands, and more points are awarded when you capture an enemy unit. There are also air units that try to take you out from above. It's very difficult to kill the aerial units, but careful aim and a little luck can get you a ton of points. The thing that makes Field Combat particularly cool, though, is that you can deploy your own soldiers, tanks, helicopters, and cannons into battle by pressing A and B at the same time. The best part is that the number of units at your disposal is increased by capturing enemies.
The controls here are pretty sluggish, but workable. Though you will move fairly slow and the crosshair is a bit finicky, it's not impossible to make decent progress.
This is visually the least impressive of these 3 games, but there's also a lot of stuff happening on the screen as well. The Genesis 3 is very well animated, and the enemies all have multiple frames of animation as well, making things look fairly decent despite the early age of Field Combat.
This is also the only game of these 3 that has a background tune. Sure, it's just an arrangement of Ride of the Valkyries, but it works. The sound is more than acceptable with suitable gunfire, explosions, and capture sound effects.
As with the other 2 games, a 2-player alternating mode is present to see who can score the highest. Again, this game is nothing really special, but it's still pretty fun if you can get past the finicky shooting, slow control, and sometimes cheap enemy fire. So, how do these 3 early Jaleco games stack up? Let's take a look. The controls in all 3 games are pretty slippery, but the edge goes to Exerion while Formation Z is left in the dust.
These are all pretty early games, and the controls can be pretty frustrating at times.
Looping Exerion and Formation Z is a snap, but Field Combat presents a much greater challenge in its stages.
These games take a bit of getting used to, but once you figure them out, they're not especially hard to play.
All 3 games will last as long as you can, making for good competition pieces, but all 3 have relatively few stages. It feels as if there's more to Field Combat, though.
These games are super short and will begin feeling very repetitive very quickly.
Both Exerion and Formation Z have nifty visuals that stand out from the typical game in 1985, while field combat doesn't hold up quite as well.
The visuals here are all good for their time, yet still very basic.
All three games have mediocre sound at best. Exerion in particular is irritating, and Formation Z is almost totally devoid of sound.
None of these games have sound that I would consider good.
All three of these games have interesting mechanics that made them more interesting to play overall. Exerion has inertia-based movement, Formation Z has the mode change, and field combat presented the option of capturing enemies rather than just killing them.
Exerion feels a bit too samey, even compared to many games of its time, but field combat does neat things with the enemy capture. Formation Z's mode change was also pretty cool.
All three of these early Jaleco games are far from perfect, and perhaps a little nostalgia can go a long way, especially for people who had a strong attachment to pirated multicarts like 31-in-1 and the like. But despite their heavy flaws, especially in the control and sound areas, all three aren't a complete bust. However, they're still not entirely worth the sum of their parts. If you're looking to test the water with any of these games, you're in luck. They can all be had for under $10 each. However, your mileage is definitely going to vary.